Why 10 properties in 10 years to make $100,000 passive income doesn't work for most people. Hi, I'm Sam Powell.
I'm Jaryd Krause, and we're the co-hosts of the Property Pals Australia podcast. And in this episode, Sam and I speak to Jong, who is a qualified property investment advisor, a seasoned property investor, and the founder and CEO of Game Plans, which is the first of its kind property strategy and planning system used by over 160 buyers agents across Australia.
Yeah, we have some really good chats, and we discuss things like where do people go wrong when setting up, their property portfolio strategy, and we also discuss, some of the most common roadblocks that get in the way to expand the property portfolio for most people, and more importantly, what are a few solutions are to that?
Yeah, we'll talk about the 5 things you can do to buy another property outside of what's actually holding you back, probably being borrowing capacity. We also talk about the realities of the 10 properties in 10-year goal to make 100K passive income that's been fed to most people through marketing, and why this may or may not work for the average Joe and most people in Australia. But before we get stuck in this pod, I want to let you know this is not the only way that we can help you for free. Head to propertypals.au/resources and download our How to Maximize Your Borrowing Capacity mini course to help you buy a superior asset and achieve a better ROI in your property portfolio. Let's dive into the pod. Welcome to Property Pals, the podcast where we share everything around how to build a property portfolio, from researching areas, financing, structuring, buying, selling, and reinvesting to live a life of financial independence. As a disclaimer, any information shared by myself, Jaryd, Sam, and the Property Pals team is strictly general and should not be taken as constituting professional advice. You should consider seeking independent legal, financial, and taxation advice from a qualified professional. Jordan, welcome to the pod. Thanks for coming on, man.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me on. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited to dig into what you've been doing in the property space. Sam filled me in a little bit. I checked out what you've done on your site. Also know a little bit about, he mentioned some stuff you're doing outside of the property game in online business, because that's my game as well. So I'm not sure if we'll dig into that on air, but I want to, maybe for the listeners, it would be good to know, and for me as well, how did you and Sam meet, and why did you get into property?
Yeah, so Sam and I met in the industry, essentially, in the property space. We've worked for a number of individuals, I'd say, over the last, 4 or 5 years, Sam, and sort of crossed paths a number of times between those individuals. And so it's just kind of been this residual integration with all of the businesses that we work with and the partners that we get to work with. And then I moved to the Gold Coast in January last year, and Sam and I kind of knew each other. But then, we decided to catch up and say hello, and I know the company that Sam works with really well, and so we kind of all get to hang out and catch up during the week as just a friendly thing, and I guess we've just become a lot closer since moving to the Goldie.
Yeah, sick.
Full side of the Gold Coast where we get to lay on the beach and talk property.
Exactly, the dream, living the dream.
It's a dream spot. It's a dream spot for sure. I don't know. I've got some pretty high level questions, mostly around where people get blocked where they come up with certain roadblocks in building a property portfolio, and what sort of holes they have in their strategy. Sam and I were talking about the common path or the common goal of retire in 10 years from property, which has been blasted in the marketing. And how realistic is it for the average Joe to get there, and versus somebody who's starting out, average Joe, and then somebody who may be in business with a bit of a higher income? What's the difference there? The compounding must change the goalpost so much.
Yeah, the old 10 properties in 10 minutes spiel has definitely been overused out there. But look, to run the numbers, I'm a numbers guy, so generally this is how I operate. The average income is about 92 grand. So if you've got both partners working, the average household income is roughly around 180K. Now, times change, but generally you can borrow about 6 times your income. Now, during COVID, when money was cheap, you could borrow about 7.5 times your income. Today, you can only borrow about 5 times your income because the economy is a little bit tighter. So if we take that 180K and times it by 6, you can borrow around $1 million as a general household income with 2 partners, average Joe working their way. So if most people can only borrow about $1 million, let's just call it 1.1, 1.2, if you're lucky with some flexibility, what that means is 2 scenarios generally happen. The first one is an investor starts or someone buys their first property. They buy property number 1, let's say it's 500K. Then they're an investor, they go and buy property number 2 and property number 3. So portfolio value, roughly 500K each, would be around 1.5 million. And the debt on that would be close to 1.1, 1.2. And this is why we commonly see most people get stuck at 1 to 2 or 3 properties if they're lucky. Because generally, most people have that borrowing capacity limit where they do get stuck. And this is when they start to reach out to professionals, like they hound mortgage brokers or buyer's agents or property professionals to get guidance around how, they hear these people in the media that have got 20 properties or 200 properties, like these extreme numbers that are out there. And they kind of put these people on a pedestal and go like, how are they able to do it? Without realizing that generally those people mostly have a really, really high income that's driven from their business. And so on an average household income, it really is hard to grow a massive residential portfolio the same way that these other guys have done it. So I'd say that's kind of where most people get stuck. The other side of that, obviously, is if maybe you had settled down with a partner, got married, had kids, and then you wanted to buy the family home. Let's say that you bought a long-term home for 900, 1.1, 1.2, again, you're kind of stuck there with your borrowing capacity because the debt on that would be anywhere from 800 to 1, depending on what type of asset that you bought. And again, if you go to Mr. Banker and say, hey, I've heard about this property investing thing, I'd love to buy my first investment property, the borrowing capacity left is only 200 or 300K, and that's really not enough to buy a decent quality investment property to allow you to keep going. So I'd say most people get stuck in terms of the earlier decisions they make in building out their portfolio, and it's generally like the household income that is the limiting factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it goes down to a point that I guess it's the psychology, right? Like as Joe and Jane public, we get taught go to school, go to a trade or go to university or whatever, get a job, and then work that job, save money, and buy your home. And then I've seen that in people's journey is like that's really, really common, and we're not educated as to other alternatives as a result. So it's kind of like unwinding it, but I guess you've seen a number of portfolios in your time, and I guess that was Jordan and I. I came across Jordan back in the day, and he taught me about property strategy. I didn't know what he was building in the background with this, basically tech solution to. I guess I was describing to Jaryd. I look at it like a financial planning model for property in regards to like it plans out like a roadmap for property acquisition, and it's actually the most accurate thing I've actually seen, and all the fluff gets taken out of. As we said, the 10 properties in 10 years, Jaryd, it was a bit of a barrier to educate people because they get all the shiny ball, like I can retire, and I'll have $100,000 passive income, and this plan tells me I can do it. That's great, and then you break down the numbers and you realise that there's a lot more to it.
I think it'd be worth going over that as well. There's like that. Sorry to interject, Sam, but the realities of like Joe Public, average person, average income, like you mentioned, Jordan, 180K between 2 people. What's the actual timeline to maybe 50K passive or 100K passive with resi and coupling, maybe even with like eventually getting into commercial? What do you think, Sam? Do you reckon that'd be valuable?
Jordan, I had a couple of questions for you, but in typical fashion, we just jump around and riff it, and that's just how we go. But we'll definitely do a bit of an intro, but I want to talk about, I guess, to give this guy some credibility of who he actually is. Game Plans is a software system that is used by a vast majority, over 160 buyers agents around Australia, from what I understand. and it's the most comprehensive platform to help people understand, where they are today to where they want to be, and using property as a vehicle to get there. And it takes into account, all the costs involved, and then is a more realistic viewpoint. And then your UX UI, like your designing, is actually really helpful, because some people are visual, others are number driven, but it's actually changing how people can, I guess, see the future. And that's what we like to do, is see that and work your way backwards to get there. And it's, I guess, one of those things that has been needed, but because property isn't in the financial servicing domain, it hasn't been focused on, because they can't legally advise on property as a financial planner. So yeah, that's a quick little background. And I mean, there's even more to Jordan than that with Homefront Today. There's this newsletter that I look at every single day. He's got this brain that likes to summarize things in the most efficient manner. And I jump on that, subscribe to that as well. But that's a really good snapshot every single day of sort of what's going on in the property market. But yeah, there's my little fanboy piece for you, mate.
Thank you, Sammy. I don't know if I could do a better introduction myself, so thank you.
Oh, it's a bit awkward if you're talking about yourself.
True, very true.
But yeah, I think going back to that point, Jaryd, Jordan's brain, he's seen that many plans. This guy's done more property plans than anyone, and he's overseen, obviously he's got all the statistics and data around that, and you'll hear that throughout this podcast. So I think, yeah, man, let's jump in. That standard, I guess, case of owner-occupier starting there, they do come to people and they go, look, I've got my owner-occupier. They've paid it down, looking for a 50K or 100K passive income. In my experience, it's not a 10-year journey. And obviously, as we've found out with everything in property, it's always case by case. But what would you think could be like the most common that you said? It was Joe and Jane at 180 grand. Say they've got that 150 grand as a deposit, and they're ready to build out a portfolio. What does that kind of look like time frame wise? Like I guess factor in, say they are owner occupiers. They paid off that owner occupied debt, and so it's similar to that investor case. Like 150 grand. Savings is really well. You've got a passive household income of 180, 190. What's the realistic time frame to get to that sort of passive income target?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we could build out a live scenario if you want to, but I'll just go off the riff and then we can jump into the numbers if you want. But essentially what we see is most people can achieve their goals in 3 to 5 properties. And it depends on the time frame that you want to achieve it by, right? So you might have a 20 or 30-year-old who's just starting in their career and they've got their whole working career ahead of them. And they know that they want to build a bigger asset base. And so for them, achieving that 50 grand might not be a major priority. Maybe they really want to build that asset base first. And so this is kind of like why we do property strategy, right? It's just about understanding where they currently are and what their actual goals are. Like, what do they want to deliver? Or what do they want out of property? So for that individual, it might be, okay, well, let's get into 1 or 2 high growth assets first. Let's maximize that borrowing capacity with really A-grade assets. And it might take us a little bit longer to get to that passive income goal. Generally, I would say in that scenario, if you are sacrificing a little bit of rental income for higher growth, it does take longer. And it can take anywhere between, I'd say, 20 to 30 years to get that 50K passive income, if that's just the assets that you bought. Because what you do need is offset your loans, and it takes a little while to pay off those loans completely. And then eventually you've got enough rental income that's covering the costs and you pay off the debt completely. And then you'll be generating about 50 to 60K on that sort of average household income with your limiting ability of around 1.2 portfolio today. The other scenario is you might, and age isn't a factor, right? Because you can get 20 or 30-year-olds who want to retire by 35 or 40. You can also get 50-year-olds who have had it hard their whole life and they just want to set up for the next generation so that they don't have it as hard as they did. And so they still want to build a growth portfolio at 50 because they want to help the next generation, right? So it depends on the time horizon. If you wanted to go as aggressively as you possibly could towards this passive income target of 50 grand, you can start to use other alternative strategies, like potentially moving into the commercial sector. And in commercial, it's a little bit different because the lending game's a little bit more flexible than residential. So we can kind of break those barriers of, the 1.2 millions as we were talking about before. But commercial properties also have a net yield, which essentially means the tenant pays for all of the outgoings. Now, every lease is a little bit different depending on, who the tenant is and what the criteria is and everything else like that. But generally, you can get a net yield of anywhere between upwards of 6.5%. So if your target was to hit that 50K passive income as soon as possible, you could potentially do it in 10 years. It's just the asset type or asset class that you're buying, you might be sacrificing a little bit of that growth. And if you run the numbers, and this is kind of why we allow scenarios on the platform, is you can do high growth scenario and you can do high cash flow scenario. And you go, okay, well, the opportunity cost of going high cash flow is, yes, I can achieve that goal in 10 years. But I'm going to miss out on $2 or $3 million worth of equity over 20 or 30 years. Yeah. And if you can see and analyze those numbers and go, okay, well, that's worth the sacrifice. I just want to retire as soon as possible and have that passive income coming through, then I'm going to aim for that trajectory. But typically, if you talk about like generally owner occupier, let's say that they've already utilized, 2/3 of their borrowing capacity. They're happy where they're living. They're not going to change where they're going to live over time. They're happy with the house that they've got. It would look like buying one investment property, essentially, let's say 50K passive income. Let's say an average of a 5% rental yield, or maybe I think 5% is good. You're going to need at least $1 million asset base that's paid off completely. So, what you're looking for there is at least one or two residential investments. It might even just be one resi and then one smaller commercial. And essentially you just want to pay that $1 million worth of debt down as soon as possible. I'd say it'd probably take 15 to 20 years. You pay that down completely and then you would have circa 50 to 100K worth of passive income coming in between 15 to 20 years, I'd say.
Yeah, I put another little entrance in there is to Jordan's model also factors in inflation. So we're talking 50K today. Obviously, with inflation, that's going to be more in the future, but your living expenses are also going to be more. So it's a great way to once again a realistic viewpoint.
Yeah, we forecast out of 30 years. So just rough numbers. If you were aiming for, let's say, 100K worth of passive income, in over 30 years, it's almost double at the RBA's bandwidth of 2.5%. So RBA likes to have inflation target at 2.5%. Whether they achieve that or not, I don't know if they're going to be successful. But if you take your 100K over 30 years, you double it. So your target really should be about 200K in 30 years' time.
Got ya. I love that. Also, we're talking really about strategy here, and Sam's put a really good question down around, why is it important, outside the factors you just mentioned, why is it important for investors to prioritize strategy before they're even considering location and asset types, other than outside what you've already mentioned, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I think for me, and this is kind of like the whole reason that I got into strategy, is I don't know what you called them before, Sam. It was like Joe and Sam or Jane or something like that. Just the average household. Like that was us before I started the business and got into property and everything else like that. I got addicted to property. Like I knew property investing was what I wanted to do. And I was on a low income to start, bought my first property for 400 grand, second one for 474, my third one for 483, right? So I'm the 3 properties at 500K guy. And I was reading the Steve McKnight's 130 properties in 2.5 years. I was listening to the professionals that were out there that had portfolios of 200K. And I would be like, that's who I want to be. Like, that's where I want to get. And so for me, when I started investing, I just aggressively bought these 3 properties. I really had no insight, no thought process around what I actually wanted out of property. I just wanted to be this property investor. And it wasn't until I got that point where I went to Mr. Banker and he said, you can't borrow anymore, where I went, what do you mean I can't borrow anymore? Like there's these guys out there that are able to do it. Like why can't I borrow anymore? And so I had bought what I would consider now 3 B or C grade properties. They weren't the best possible properties that I could have bought. And if I'd just taken a little bit longer to analyze like my time horizon and what I actually wanted out of property long-term, bigger picture, I might have just taken an extra 6 months or 12 months to go, hey, I can save a little bit more. Hey, the best deal that's out there is on the market right now. Maybe instead of buying 300, 400, 500K properties, I could buy one really good one for 800K. Take a little bit longer, buy a better asset, get into the best possible asset that I can today, so that for me, over the next 30 years, I'm going to have a much better outcome than just buying 3 C grade properties. And the reason I say that, and predominantly it's more focused in Australia, because we've got very high transaction costs. It costs about 6% to buy a property, so stamp duty, building and pest, conveyancing, all that sort of stuff, and 3% to sell a property, so sales agents' fees, again, conveyancing, all that sort of stuff, right? And so transacting on property, buying and selling property is very expensive. At a minimum, you're going to need at least 10 to 15% growth to even just cover your costs of transacting on a property. And so buying in and out of property, if you're not an active investor, which means like you're not doing a renovation or, actively adding value to the property, it wasn't a strategy that I was implementing, and I needed at least 10 to 15% growth to get into these things. And like in the back of my head, because I'm a numbers guy, I'm going, but if I hold on to this thing for the next 30 years, I'm going to have a much better outcome. I don't want to have to sell these assets. And so when we talk about property strategy, what we really want to just do is sit down, understand where you currently are, understand what your actual goals are and the time horizons are to get there, and then go, well, what are the best possible moves that we can make between now and then to get you closer towards your goals without trying to make a mistake, so you don't have to pay excess transaction costs, so you're not paying capital gains tax on the way out, so you're not buying a dud asset because you feel like you just have to continue investing. And what are the moves that we can make to ultimately execute on that plan? Once we've got that plan in place, there's a common quote that I love. It's like, I heard it the other day for the first time and I love it. And it's essentially a dream written down with a date becomes a goal broken down into steps becomes a plan backed by consistent action becomes reality. And so when strategy comes into place is that second statement of like that goal broken down into steps becomes a plan. And we really want to just understand, well, what are the steps that we need to be able to make to achieve our dream? And once we understand the steps, we can take each of those components out and go, okay, well, how do we back this with consistent action? And when we know our target property price is 800K, we need a minimum of a 4% yield. Our interest rates can't get above 8% because we're going to be out of pocket, but they're at 6% now, so we're going to be okay. Like once we know all these metrics and variables, we can go, okay, well, this is the right time in the economy. This is the right time financially for us. This is the areas that match that criteria in terms of price point and minimum yield. Then we can go and execute on that purchase and understand what the asset type is and what the location is potentially going to be, and do our due diligence around those from there, because we know the step that we're taking is going to get us towards our goals, and then we can decide, the location and the asset type that we want to go from there.
I absolutely love that. The way I think about a goal, and I've heard it explained before as well, I think about it might have been by my friend who helped rewrite The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. Talks about a goal being a system, and he's a systems guy. He's written his own book as well. His name's Dave Janines. He lives in Melbourne. Also into property too. And he says that a goal, if it's an end result, is basically just a system, which is exactly similar to what you were mentioning, Jordan. Is like a system is just a certain few steps that you need to check off, like a checklist, to be able to do and check off to achieve the certain result or the goal. And so a question towards what you've mentioned is like, if we're looking at steps that we need to take in this system to get to this goal, what are how do we determine what some of the steps are? Because they're going to be on the things we need to check off, because they're going to be different between each individual based on their income and their goal. How do people go away and work out what some of those things are that they need?
Yeah, so there's kind of three, like building any portfolio, there's kind of three critical things that we need to watch as we're going through building our portfolio. The first one is what we've kind of touched on in terms of borrowing capacity. Everyone hits a wall at some point in time. Everyone's got a wall where they go, okay, well, at least the major four banks go, okay, it's going to be a little bit tougher to give you lending based on that. Now, there are things we can do. There are other types of assets that we can buy in. We can go to second and third tier lenders. It's not like a hard no, but it is harder to get lending. The second thing or variable that we watch for is safety buffers. So for me, over time, my safety buffers increased. I used to be comfortable with 3 months worth of savings in the bank. Then I moved to 6 months, and now that I've got a business and a family and a big mortgage, like for me, having less than 12 months worth of savings is really scary because, I would need to make a financial decision before 12 months is up to decide what we're going to do to survive, right? So we want to monitor our safety buffer, which is essentially just meaning like, say your monthly expenses is, let's say for argument's sake, 10 grand. So your mortgage, all your groceries, your living costs, school fees, anything else like that, roughly costs you around 10 grand a month. If you wanted 6 months worth of savings on hand, you would just times that by 6, and you'd need as a minimum of 60 grand worth of savings as a safety buffer. Now, some people will do that with equity, so they'll refinance a property, sit that equity in one of their offset accounts, and they've got 100 grand worth of equity just sitting there. Obviously, if you take away from that equity, you're going to be paying interest, which isn't favorable, but it is a good cash buffer available for you. Second thing is safety buffer, just making sure you've got enough in the kitty to allow you to keep going, sleep well at night, look after your family, etc., etc. And then the third one is cash flows. So there's kind of been a big shock for everyone over the last 2 or 3 years as interest rates have gone from retail to us from 3% to now sort of 6.5%. It's almost a double of interest repayments, or even more for some people. And so that's a bit of a shock to the system. And so what we do with our online software is essentially go, okay, well, what happens if interest rates go up by 2% or 3% or 4%? What happens to our monthly cash flow position after that occurs? And are we going to be able to afford it? Factoring in, current rental yields and everything else like that. And if we've moved, it's a very extreme scenario, what we've seen over the last couple of years, but some people have gone into that situation where they were extremely positively geared to now they might not even be neutrally geared. And vice versa, we've seen people who might have been neutrally geared to go extremely negatively geared. And that's actually put them in a financial position where they had to make a decision to sell a property because they just simply couldn't afford to hold on to it. And as I said before, the transaction costs on property are really expensive. And so all in all, after transaction costs, they might have actually lost money on that property, which is really not an ideal situation. Obviously we're going to do it to survive, but ideally it's not what you want to do. And so if we can monitor those three things, what's our borrowing capacity look like? Are we going to be able to do another purchase, or when are we going to be able to do another purchase? Do we have enough in the bank to make sure that we can buy another property plus have some safety buffer left over? And is our cash flows after we do our next purchase going to be comfortable enough for us to execute? Because generally what happens is people will go out in today's market and they'll buy a property, let's say that's negative 15 grand for argument's sake, it's costing them $1,000 a month. There's only so many of those you can buy, right? First one's 15, second one's 30, and the third one's 45 grand. Now, if you're hemorrhaging 45 grand towards the portfolio every single year, that's a lot of money of your income, right? And so what we do with planning these steps is saying, okay, we can afford one negative 15 grand property because there's going to be good growth and build our equity base and our wealth base over time. But when it comes to the second one, maybe we can't be negative 15 grand. Maybe as a minimum, we can be negative 5 grand. And so that then impacts the price point. It impacts the yields. It impacts the locations that we can go and buy in. So yeah, there's just kind of some of the variables and things that we think about for each step, just to make sure that we can execute on those properties without ever being in a position where we're compromised and maybe have to sell.
Yeah, I love it. That's comes down to I guess value of mindset is risk, and the way to succeed in this property game, in my mind, is being able to hold these assets through multiple cycles. And if you're forced selling, I always think worst case scenario, say you're not in a growth phase in your suburb or government area, and then you need to sell that asset. It is expensive, so one, that's stress, but if you do get it wrong from the cash flow point of view that Jordan talks about, it's not an enjoyable journey. But to plan it out, and that's when we're talking about strategy too. People come to us and oh, I've got borrowing capacity. The mortgage broker's telling me I can, borrow $800,000, or I can buy up to $800,000, and it's okay, cool. Well, that's one factor. like the next factor that I go into is like, well, what are the cash flow requirements? And then what are your bigger goals? And that's where I think starting with that strategy piece before even like as a primary allows you to, well, or also if you're talking to a property strategist, they're deeply connected with other professionals in the industry that can guide you in certain ways. But it does form, what that next purchase might be, because just because you can borrow $800,000 doesn't mean that you should be purchasing an $800,000 property. And then it goes to locations and going, well, whereabouts in Australia is showing growth as a primary that can maintain that cash flow, and that helps to build out that strategy from a initial purchase, but then going deeper into going, well, what's your bigger picture? And that's where I guess Jaryd and I talk about that bigger picture a fair bit, and that's what Jordan's really all about, is seeing what is the end goal. And I think people do lack that, like it's the FOMO kind of thing, right? Where people, they see people making money in property, they're investing, they're on their social media, it's just fed at them. They want to jump in. They just, kind of similar to Jordan's story, which is, you just get in and you start buying, and you're not actually thinking about the implications of that. And, I know it does take a little bit of time to start out, but it's like that classic, if you're was it planning to, if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail kind of quote that, I don't know, throw quotes around. Jaryd, you're a bit of a quote man. But yeah, there's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, we've all got some good quotes, don't we? So, Jordan, I mean, what Sam's mentioning is like the plan that like most people hear these podcasts or YouTube videos and case studies of people that have achieved these insane results and go away and go, all right, I'm going to do that as well. It's the same in my business. People hear like, oh, this person made, $3,000. They're making $3,000 a month after 3 months of, working with this person or whatever it is. And they don't understand the realities of what that individual, the resources that individual actually has in terms of finances, time capacity to be able to look for properties or be able to afford a buyer's agent even, or, what sort of they can afford in terms of setting up structures and whatnot. So I want to ask you, like, from some of the investors that have done very well and built out portfolios, what sort of things have they done that's, aside from earning a bigger amount of money through business, what are some of the things that they have done and put in place that the average Joe, like myself starting out, can employ?
Yeah, cool. So I think like outside of that borrowing capacity limit, there's 5 ways that you can break it. Like there's 5 ways that you can continue investing to build a bigger portfolio. The first one and the most common, like this is like if most people have a rather large portfolio, generally is they've just increased their income generally through starting a business. So increasing income is the most important thing. And I'm not talking about like 5 or 10 grand pay rises here. Like you can only borrow 6 times your income, right? So if you get a 10 grand pay rise, that's only 60 more grand that you're going to have in terms of borrowing capacity. That's not enough to buy another 2 or 3 properties, right? So I'm not talking about like smaller pay rises. I'm talking about big income changes. Like these are people that are earning millions of dollars a year, and they can get a 6 times leverage on that, which means they can get $6 million worth of debt, which means they could have a portfolio of 8 to 10 million, right? You divide that by 500, there's your 20 property portfolio. Generally, that's how they've achieved it. That's only number 1 though. Number 2 thing that you could potentially do is look to move into, and I'm not an accountant, or a mortgage broker or a financial planner, so talk to your accountant or professional around this particular advice, but move into a company/trust structure. Now, just because you set up a trust doesn't mean you're going to get more lending. It is the way that some of the professionals have done it in the past. Generally, there's only 2 reasons I like to buy a property in a trust. Number 1 is for asset protection. So if you are in a career or have a business where you potentially get sued, having an asset in a trust gives you more protection around that asset. So if someone comes after you, they may still be able to get after you. And like legislation, all the changes all the time. So don't just do it just because of this, but it does give you some more protection around it. Or number 2 is if you are hitting like certain tax thresholds, like land tax thresholds or something like that. Maybe you've got a certain asset base on land in a particular state. If you buy it under a secondary entity, then you do break those land tax thresholds again, and you can sort of move around. They're kind of the only really two reasons I'd buy another property in a trust. However, there are certain situations where you can work with professional bankers who will give you particular lending within a separate entity based on certain criteria. So they might say to you, hey, look, if you buy this asset on a 65% LVR, which means you're putting a lot of cash in there, but you've got a good yield of 7.5%, your interest rate is going to be 6.5%, it's a net yield, so it's going to be paying for itself in its own right, then we'll allow you to continue investing. And you don't have to have a large income, or you don't have to be a professional to be able to execute on this. There are different alternative ways of that you can getting lending within that entity to allow you to continue going. Now, that's not going to be like a typical residential property. It might be something like a commercial asset, or just a really high income type asset. It might be like a block of 4 units or something like that. But you can get different type of lending within that entity. Number 3 is moving to something called a lease stock loan. So essentially what a lease stock loan is, you can get a loan on an asset based on the rental income. So again, we're looking for higher income type assets, but they will assess that individual asset on itself and go, okay, well, if it's definitely paying for itself, it has done over the last little while. Maybe you've got a 5x5x5 lease, a long-term lease, which is, guaranteed income. It's increasing with inflation, et cetera, et cetera. That asset is covering its costs. And so we'll give you lending on that asset for a 5-year period based on the current rental agreement that you've got. So you can get the lending to continue going. However, it is a little bit riskier because it's a lesser time period. When that 5 years is up, you're going to have to refinance and, get new lending on it or sell. A little bit riskier strategy, but it does allow you to continue investing. The fourth way, and this is probably the riskiest of all the scenarios, is potentially look at doing something like a joint venture. This is where we typically see like family members invest together, or external partners that are really close, like maybe business partners starting to invest together. And so, like, let's say that you've got the cash, you've got the deposit of $200,000, but you don't have any more borrowing capacity. Well, your joint venture partner might have the borrowing capacity to allow you to continue investing, right? So he's got the borrowing capacity, you've got the cash, so you can continue building your portfolio that way. Now, the reason I say this is most risky is that you don't have full control of that asset. So what we commonly see is something like brothers are buying a property together, right? Smart, they're young, they want to get into investing, they can do it, they can buy a better asset together. It is generally quite smart. But what we see happens is brother number 2 all of a sudden gets a partner. And then they're together for 2 years, and then they want to get married. And then they get married, and then they're about to have a kid. And partner number 2 comes to brother number 1 and says, hey, we really want to settle down and buy our family home, but the bank said that we can't lend anymore because we've got this asset together. Like, I'm going to have to sell this asset so that we can buy our family home. And so brother number 1 is now in a compromised position because maybe he doesn't have enough to buy out brother number 2. Maybe he doesn't want to sell. He wants to hold on to this asset and keep it over the long term. And so it creates this conflict of interest of like one person wants to do one thing and another person wants to do another thing. So you don't have full control of what happens over that asset. And again, there's transaction costs. You're going to have to sell the property. It's a little bit riskier. And then number 5 is a little bit less risky, but still risky, is buying in something called a syndicate, which is essentially where a group of people come together. They all contribute the same amount or a certain percentage towards a larger asset. And they come together to buy this bigger asset to have that rental yield, or buy the asset for the growth prospects to come together. So not as risky because everyone in a syndicate is coming together for a reason, to continue investing. However, again, you don't have full control over that asset, and there's generally annual reviews or 5-year reviews in terms of what everyone wants to do with the asset. So again, you don't have full control, but it is a way, if you do have cash and you want to continue investing, that will allow you to continue investing moving forward from there. So I think, that's probably generally the 5 ways people can continue to investing outside of like the typical borrowing capacity.
What do you think is the smartest way to do it?
If it was me, like I wouldn't say I'm a control freak, but I would like to have ultimate decision on what I do with my asset base, is I would max out with the residential portfolio in my general borrowing capacity. So buy $1.2, $1.5 million worth of really good A-grade growth properties. Then I would use the equity, build the equity within there, extract that, and use that as a deposit for these lease stock loan commercial type assets. And that way, like generally the residential portfolio will be a little negatively geared. Then you're kind of diversifying not only with asset type, moving into commercial, but you're diversifying in terms of like what the asset is focused on. Commercial is generally more income focused. And so you've kind of got like these two things balancing themselves. High growth over here, and then you're doing lease stock loan with the commercial assets with higher income coming in. Hopefully the overall cash flows are neutralizing themselves out and will continue to grow and grow so that you do get to a passive income stream at some point in time. But that would allow you to continue investing in your own personal name while having full control and building your portfolio that's quite balanced.
Yeah, love it. I talk to people about obviously properties, and like obviously I'm just I guess probably a number of years away from your sort of brain with how many strategies you've run, but I have the same thing where people are like, oh, I want to build like a massive property portfolio and take over the world. Steve McKnight or was it Birchie 200 or something like that. But then I have a chat to them and say, look, with even 30 properties, you've got 30 kitchens, you've got 30 hot water systems, you've got maybe 60 aircon units. Like, what's that implication on your cash flow, and how does that really look? To zoom out, look at the bigger picture, and you go, well, what is it actually that you're trying to target? And no one's really buying the property because we're interested in property, but it's the lifestyle and I guess that freedom that most people are chasing. And I mean, with a massive property portfolio, do you have that freedom? Obviously, you can outsource to property managers, but thinking through it is quite important. And that's like that switch where Jaryd's going through that journey himself, and we're having a good chat. And I was like, mate, I think you're ready for a commercial because you're making good income. You've got some really strong quality residential assets. You're looking for that income play, and now's that time for some commercial exposure. So it makes more logical sense to me. Is kind of what that plan that you laid out. But not everyone's like commercial's a different mindset too for people. Like, can you sort of help educate people around like I guess the pros and cons to commercial?
For sure. And you're spot on. Like we commonly say, like 30 properties is 30 headaches, right? Like it is, even though you do have a property manager, they're still hitting you up when things are breaking or there's a certain limit or something like that. And it's funny you mentioned Steve McKnight because he's done the exact same thing. So if his portfolio now, he's just got 3 really nice big commercial properties. That's all he's got. So he's gone from having 200 headaches or whatever the number was to just 3 really good quality properties. And I think that's what kind of most people do is they kind of build this asset base, they build it up, and then they realize, well, I don't really need to deal with 30 people. I can just deal with 1 and have a good quality property. And I think ultimately that's what a good portfolio is. But commercial in its sense is just something a little bit different. Like, and a good friend of mine who is a commercial buyer's agent often says like, people in residential say like everyone needs a roof over their head. And he says, well, where does the roof get built? Right. And so commercial assets is essentially where businesses operate. And they're needed. Like if you think about how things change over time, like, we had office spaces was such a big thing for a long time. And now COVID's changed that where remote work becomes a little bit more flexible, but people have this sense and drive of community. Like there's people that actually want to go into an office and work and see people every single day. The same is true for like Amazon fulfillment, right? Like for Amazon to have a quick delivery time, they've got to have local areas everywhere that can store these facilities and will have the facilities to store particular items so that they can get delivered quite quickly. Every business needs to operate out of a particular area. And so when we talk about commercial, generally there's a business that's operating out of that asset. And instead of, a mum and dad having a roof over their head, it's just a business to operate out from. And yeah, it's definitely a lot harder to comprehend. It's a lot harder to think about. It is a different asset class altogether than residential, but fundamentally it is still a property. You are still ultimately buying a block of land and a dwelling that will deteriorate over time on top of it. So ultimately the way that I still see it is like, well, I just want to buy the best land possible. Like, cause I think long-term big picture, I just want to buy the best land that I possibly can. Whether that's a residential or a commercial dwelling doesn't really matter. They've both got uses where someone sleeps at night. It's just that either a family sleeping in there or a business is operating out of it. It's still bricks and mortar that will deteriorate over time, but the land component is ultimately what I want. So very different. There's a lot of different due diligence that you need to do. It's more business, like business related due diligence. Who's the business? What are they operating? How long have they been in business? What are their cash flows like? Are they able to, continue renting out this place? If they were to leave, what other businesses would want to lease this particular location? Are they comfortable working from there? Is it close to their clients? Is it close to their suppliers? All that sort of stuff. So it is a whole different ball game in terms of due diligence. But again, that's why I like to work with professionals for every purchase that I do, because my expertise isn't in one particular asset class or one particular market. My expertise is strategy. So I know strategy and I'll stick to that, and I'm happy to pay other people to do what they're best at. Yeah, the learning curve is awesome. Like I did this with Resi, right? Like I just listened to all the podcasts, read all the books, and like learn everything that I possibly could about Resi, and then it just becomes mundane because like investing is actually quite simple. It's not about making like fancy moves or that's the secret sauce. Like it's just you stick to the fundamentals. And so when you move to commercial, it's like you go on this whole train of learning again. And you're like, oh wow, this is amazing. But at the end of the day, it's just really fundamentals. But at least you get to learn something new, right?
Yeah, it's a journey. I mean, so it's not for everybody, but I definitely think everybody should at least do a bit of homework and research into it, especially for that passive income goal. Like, say, there's no such thing as, in my mind anyway, there's no such thing as passive. And if you're buying something and just leaving it, then it's probably not a wise investment space to be in. But from like the two, the tenants do pay the outgoings in the majority of the cases, and it's in their best interest to upkeep the commercial property, right? Because they're running a business out of it. So I find that from a passive side of things, commercial is definitely more in favour than the resi. But the cash flow drawdowns during vacancy periods need to be realised as well. But I think it's just that evolution of an investor as you grow, and then it's going into even as the mind of a business owner, where you're looking at business cycles and understanding, what makes a good commercial investment. You're looking in the business itself and how that works, and it's a cool little journey to go down. So from bringing it all back to strategy is, I think, Jordan's put a really good little summary. It was like, you start out in that residential space, get your capital growth, get your asset base built up, and then think a few years ahead and go, well, what is it that I'm really trying to achieve? Utilizing that equity, you've got a sell down period of a residential asset to get into a commercial, or pull out equity and then go into commercial. I think it's always a smart play if you're open to it. But if you are going down that route, then at the very least, get educated. Jaryd mentioned Steve Police. He's been on here a few times, and he's got a really great commercial property book. Start there. But if you have any questions, obviously, I think leading with that strategy is always primary, because you've got to build that team around you, right? And I guess the qualified property investment advisor course that Jordan, he's in that realm, and I tagged along and put that under my belt as well. I think it teaches you a lot, but then you start as a professional, you start putting people around you. Like you've got your network of trusted people because there's so many shiny brochures out there, showing you things that are leading you down a path of just buying this certain particular asset type. And I think that's not the right place to start. You start with strategy, then look at your finance, and then grow out that over time to see what suits you. But like another thing too that I'd jump in to say is you don't know what the future holds, right? Like things change. I mean, Jaryd saw me go from single Sam to dad Sam with 2 kids, and it's been a beautiful journey. And I didn't think that I would love that so much, when I was single Sam. But being that mind of actually just taking the step and buying that first investment, just starting it, that set me up for a more stress-free future. But also the residential assets that I've accumulated, it gives you that ability to go, I've got options here. Whereas that analysis paralysis is a massive issue for most people. And I think if you are out there listening to this and you're struggling with a bit of analysis paralysis, let's have a strategy session and jump on to see what this 30-year plan looks like for you, and it'll create a lot of comfort for you to take that next step.
Yeah, in saying that, Jordan, talking about strategy, where can we send people to check out more about what you're up to, what you've built? And also, it's been so good to treat your brains and have you come on the pod. I'm sure we'll have you back on again. It's been absolutely awesome.
No, thanks, mate. I'm pretty active on all socials, so Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I've started the TikTok phase, so you'll see some interesting content over there. That's generally where you'll see a lot of my content. Other than that, feel free to ever just shoot me an email, jordan@gameplans.com.au. But if you're looking to build out a plan, definitely contact Sam. He'll be able to have a chat to you around how that all looks and sort of how you want to look at your own portfolio and your own journey and sort of map that out over the next 30 years. He'd be your best sort of point of contact there.
Yeah, I love what you're doing, mate, with the socials. It's you're getting that philosophical, inspirational.
I love it. It's good fun. I actually I used to make content pretty heavily 3 or 4 years ago, and then when I started the business, I stopped for whatever reason. But I actually genuinely enjoy the process of making content and making it interesting. So I appreciate the kind word.
Yeah, love it. All right, thanks again, Jordan. We'll speak to you soon. Everybody that is listening, thank you so much for listening. If you haven't, hit the subscribe button, and we'll speak to you on the next one.